Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 top tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Lucinda Sage-Midgorden has been a story lover ever since she and her family watched TV and movies together. Her father taught her how to find the deeper layers of a story, and this love prompted her to pursue a double major BA in Religious Studies and Theatre and Speech, and then an MA in Theatre Arts, and finally an MA Ed, so she could share her love of stories with all kinds of her students. She grew up in the Pacific Northwest but has lived in southern Arizona for over 24 years, moving there after a 3-month trip circumnavigating the globe. Now semi-retired, Lucinda writes her weekly blog, Sage Woman Chronicles, and is working on her second novel. And she also produces the bi-weekly podcast, Story Power. And today I talk to Lucinda about a number of things, including story analysis. She gives you some tips on how to get started with that, but story analysis really is important if you want to understand what makes story tick, how it works, and ultimately how you can write a better story. And it's not just about analysing an individual piece of work, but even analysing the genre in which you write, looking for those things that readers expect and want and help make a story come together really well. We also have those, what we call the genre expectations. So a really interesting chat. Do listen in, you'll find out about analysis, and you'll also discover what a busy woman Lucinda is. Well, Lucinda, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really delighted to have you on the show.
I'm excited to talk to another person from Scotland. I've never been to Scotland.
Oh, you must come. Edinburgh is particularly beautiful, and perfect for writers. It's a very writerly city, so you must come.
Oh yes. Okay.
But listen, tell us about you. Tell us about your journey to how you got to your first novel and how you got to where you are.
Well, that's interesting because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest of the United States in Washington and Oregon. Well, Oregon and then Washington. And that's the end of the Oregon Trail. I grew up in Portland for part of my life, and that's the end of the Oregon Trail. So that figures into my novel. But I, of course, didn't ever think that I was going to write a novel until I got to be 54 years old or 53, something like that. So I went on a circuitous route to writing the novel. My family lived in a series of really small towns, and they didn't have libraries except for the school library. And even though we did read, mostly our entertainment was watching television, movies on television, because the small towns didn't have theaters either, except for one of them had a theater, but the rest of them didn't have theaters. And so, but my father was really great at asking us questions about what we thought about what we were watching. And eventually, and that's how I learned to analyze stories, was his questions and analyzing the characters and what they did, and what events meant in terms of telling the story so that they could get the message across. And so that eventually led me to theater, which you're going to ask me about later. And theater, actually, my first major was religious studies. And the reason I took that is because I just wanted to know more about the stories in the Bible. I wanted to know more about those people and, how they lived and, stuff like that. So, and I loved that degree. That was a fun degree, but I didn't want to go any further with that. And then at the same time, I got involved in theater and loved it. And part of the reason I loved it is because when you're doing a play, you have to analyze the play. And that's one of my strengths, I think, in terms of storytelling, is being able to analyze the plot and why the motivations of the characters, why they do what they do. And even their backgrounds that influence them, sometimes unconsciously. We all have that. We have things that influence us unconsciously. And so all of that, my father and theater helped me realize, I can take what I'm learning in theater and apply it to my real life. So when I graduated from my double major bachelor's, and my husband and I moved back to Portland, Oregon, because we were going to school in Iowa. And I got a job at a travel school. I could go to work and go, oh, I see why that person is treating me like that, because it could be this or it could be that. Or, I started analyzing the people around me and why they were doing what they were doing. I didn't stay at that job very long because it was really, I'm not cut out for corporate America, I discovered, even though that was a small school, travel school. And so I went for my master's in theater and loved that and started working in the theater program in Portland. Portland has quite an active community. Mostly they have semi-professional companies, but they also have some professional companies. And so I was working mostly in a company that was subsidized by the city of Portland, and it was called the Musical Company. And I worked in their costume shop, and I was a stage manager and an actor. And I also taught through the Portland Parks and Recreation Department and the Vancouver Parks and Recreation Department, little kids. I taught drama to little kids. And then when my husband and I sold our house and took our trip around the world, we decided we were going to move to Arizona because his parents and my parents lived in Arizona. So when we came here, we moved here without jobs, which was really silly. But I eventually became a drama teacher. I started off as a substitute teacher, and then I became a drama teacher. And I realized, oh yeah, I know how to teach the students how to analyze movies or their plays, the scenes that they're in. And then that led me to I had to get a job at another school where I was teaching English, although English is not my major, but I had enough credits that I could be an English teacher, get certified in that. And that's when I realized I could be a writer, because I had to teach them how to write. And I'm really scrunching this together. And so I started teaching at the local community college. I quit teaching public school and started teaching at the local community college. And that's when I wrote my book. It took me 7 years to write The Space Between Time. I started off writing a memoir, but it was not coming together. That was not really what I was supposed to be doing. So The Space Between Time actually started quite a long time ago. Yeah. My father's been dead for 18 years, but it was at a time when we went to visit my mom and dad, and he had heart issues. And I realized, his health had kind of taken a turn. It was probably maybe 2000 or 2001. He died in 2004. And I just, on the drive home, is 5 hours from our house to their house. They lived on the opposite side of the state. And I had this idea for a story about a father and a daughter, because he is my mentor. My father was my mentor. So I started it, but then when I started teaching full time, I didn't have time to write that book. Mm-hmm. So when I realized that the memoir wasn't going to work, I went back to that story that I had started about my father. And of course, it didn't turn out like that. Because stories, if you're a writer, you have an idea and you start something and then it goes in its own direction. Well, the whole being a descendant of Oregon Trail people and plays into the book. It plays into the book in terms of there are two story timelines. And
I love novels that have got a dual timeline.
Yeah, well, I just say right now, I did not study English creative writing or anything like that. So, I started the book and it was mostly dialogue, and then I had to fill in the body language and, what was going on in their head and all that stuff. And it's not a perfect book, but there is a woman in the present who has this devastating week where her father has been dead for many years, but her mother dies in a car accident. She loses her job and her fiance leaves her all in the same week. And so yeah, well, sometimes it hits us like that. We just have these crash and burn moments. And so she was working at a publishing house in Portland. So, and part of the plot is that she was being set up. There were con men working at the publishing house, and they set her up as the person who stole the money. Okay. Although that's just sort of like a side part of the story. So she goes home to her mother's house in Southern Oregon, in Roseburg, Oregon. She lived in Portland, and she is going through her mother's things, and she finds this box that has never been opened, and it has journals in it. And they're wrapped in the old ways that they kept water out was to wrap them in oilcloth or something, some sort of cloth that kept out the water. And so she starts to read them. And instead of being like Outlander, where her whole body is transported to Scotland, to the past, it's just her consciousness that is transported into her 3 times great-grandmother. And she meets her 3 times great-grandmother at the time when her father has just died, and it's the day of his funeral. Oh. And her mother has been dead for a long time. So it's like they have this sort of, they've both lost their parents. They don't know what they're going to do with their lives, And it's in she meets her 3 times great-grandmother in 1859, which is the year that Oregon became a state.
Okay.
So she is a teacher. She has education in teaching. And so she has this offer to go to Oregon to become a teacher. And she wants to get away from her controlling aunt. And so that's what she does. So the 2 stories kind of go, Jenna in the present will go read things from her 3 times great-grandmother Morgan's journals and learn things. And yes, you asked me before we started recording if spirituality is part of my writing. And yes, it is, definitely. So it's part of the novel, but it's also part of my blog. I have a Sage Woman Chronicles is my blog, and I've been writing it.
Well, let's come to that in a minute. Let's take a step back.
Okay.
And your theatre work sounds really, really interesting. I come from a theatre background as well, and just loved it. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're in a smaller theatre like that, where you get to do a little bit of everything and you get to be fully involved with the production and all the different aspects and really live it. I think you kind of really live that production. What were some of the things that you particularly enjoyed about being in a theatre group, a theatre troupe?
One of the things that I like and also don't like is when you're rehearsing and putting the production together and then performing it. It's such a short time, but everyone kind of becomes a family. And then when the production ends, it's this sad thing because you break up and everybody goes off to different projects. And you might work with those people again, but it's never the same. I mean, it's a new family. So every production is a new, and some are dysfunctional families, unfortunately.
Yes.
But if you mesh with those people, it's like, it's just magical. It's magical.
Yeah. And so when it comes to, I mean, clearly you've always been very creative right from the beginning, starting with the TV and analyzing and breaking down and thinking about the motivations behind the characters and why they're doing what they're doing, and then taking that into the theatre. And now, again, you've taken that into fiction. Is there anything from your theatre work and studying text there that you've been able to take into the fiction writing that's proved useful?
Well, I don't know if I've been successful about it, but to me, every play that I've been in, of the playwright, if they're a good playwright, the lines have a specific rhythm to them to help convey the message of what the characters are trying to say. They're not, it's a lot of times it's not actual what we would hear on the street dialogue. Sometimes it is. I mean, of course, probably now it's really more that way, but I admire the playwrights who have a way with it. In a way, it's like poetry. Of course, it's prose, but they're written in such a way that it's an elevated language. And so I tried to do that in my novel. Of course, you have to have everyday language sometimes, but I tried to do even the things that are going on in their heads. I tried to have it be an elevated, the lines have to be rhythmically, there's something about them that I wanted to have so that they flow. And actually, I realized I wasn't very successful because I tried to do an audiobook and I went, oh, that was a kind of a clunky sentence.
Well, it's a great point that you make there, and it's something it's advisable for all authors to do, is to read aloud the draft that you've got and see how it sounds. And when you do that, you pick up those little moments that you trip over your tongue, or don't, as you say, clunky, doesn't sound quite as you'd envisaged it. So really good. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a really good tip for our listeners who are listening. I think I took from theatre, I think I'm good at dialogue, like I can get good dialogue, but what I then have to go back and do is remember to put in the bits around it and say, put in the body language and what's going on around somebody speaking. Because in my head, I'm picturing it and I can see what I might do on a stage or a TV set or whatever, but I have to remember to fill a little bit of that in for my readers so that they have some context for where this conversation is happening. Yes. So that's something I've certainly had to work on. I don't know if you had a similar experience.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I see it in my head and then I read through the draft and I go, oh, wait, I was thinking that they were going to do this. And also, I also want to do other sensory things like sounds and smells and tastes. So, it's a layered thing. I have to go through it and add this layer and then go through it and add that layer.
Yeah, I find the same. Maybe that is kind of coming from that theatre background, having to go in and remember to put these things in, because it's not 3D. It's not a human kind of doing it like you would see on a stage.
Right. Yes.
So you did mention your Sage Woman Chronicles. So I'd love to know, why did you start the blog, and tell us, who is it for? Who would enjoy the blog?
Well, it's actually for me. Although I do have about 400 followers or so. But yes, I started it in 2013 because after I wrote my memoir, which of course this is a rookie writer thing, I thought, oh, it's so wonderful. And I had someone read it and they said, your writing is very guarded, and you don't share much of yourself. You're protecting yourself. And so that's why I started the blog, was because, okay, I'm going to have to practice peeling the layers away so that I'm really honest with what's happening. And what's more honest than writing about your own life and saying, oh, I made this big mistake, or I assumed this thing and it was wrong. So that's kind of why I write it. But I do have people who follow and I don't get a whole lot of comments, but I do get likes and, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But mostly I'm just writing it for myself. It's like a journal in a way.
Yeah. I was very observant of the reader of your memoir, and I think that too is also really worth pointing out for our listeners as well. Is if we think about memoir as being this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it's telling somebody about a section of our life and what happened in that. But really, it is a form of therapy in a way, because it's not so much what happened, but it's about that emotional connection to what happened. And you are your own protagonist, and you're taking your reader through your own character arc of where you started at the beginning of that memoir, the changes and the difficulties that you went through to get to the point, the state you're at the end of the memoir. It's not so much about this happened and that happened, but I felt this and then I experienced that. Yeah, it is. I don't know if you find it that way, or find doing your blog that way as you go through those onion layers. Do you find it very therapeutic?
Well, I've been keeping a journal since I was 24, and I just turned 69. So I do that. That's what my journal is. It's my therapy. So yes, my blog is just an extension of my journal. In a way, yes, it's very therapeutic. It's actually been more therapeutic in the last couple of years since I started my podcast, because now I'm actually feeling so confident that I can say, oh man, I assumed this something or other, or whatever it is. I can tell my foibles, and I don't feel, yes, I feel vulnerable, but I don't mind being vulnerable. I don't mind. That was something that I think because I'm a highly sensitive person, I always felt like I had to protect myself from other people's energy and their opinions. And so that's why I didn't realize that until just recently, that I was protecting myself. And that's why I was so guarded. And now that I'm much more comfortable with myself and I'm able to identify, oh, that's your stuff, I don't need to take that in, and this is my stuff, then I can be more vulnerable.
And is that purely through doing the blog and journaling that you've come to that sort of that opening, that realization that what someone else is feeling is their experience and you don't need to take that on? Or has something else kind of helped you work through that?
It did start that way. Yes, it started with the journal. But I have been studying A Course in Miracles now for the 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I'm also doing an energy course on Mind Valley. They have all kinds of courses. And so yeah, I'm learning to clear out old stuff that I picked up from other people that I didn't even realize I was carrying around. So yeah, I've read practically all of the really famous spiritual teachers like Marianne Williamson and Deepak Chopra and Greg Braden and Carolyn Mace, and I could go on and on. Gary Zukav, and so Wayne Dyer. So that's all part of it too. Yeah, reading all of those spiritual teachers. And now
it is. It's lovely to delve into that and get under the surface and understand ourselves better. Because then I think, as you've said, it's not just about kind of feeling better in the moment, but I can see then, as you've said, it's it's spilled over into other parts of your life and has given you a confidence to go out there and start your podcast, for example. And how's that going? Tell me about that experience.
Well, I love doing the podcast. I started it in July of 2020 when we were locked down here in Arizona. And my husband was working from home. I had wanted to start it for quite a long time. One of my favorite classes to teach is called dramatic structure. And the reason I love it is because we talk about the themes of a story and how it's put together to get that theme across. So my podcast is sort of an outgrowth of that. It's my passion about stories and analyzing them, which is actually my strength. Creating the story is more difficult for me, but analyzing the story is really easy. So I started it in 2020 with just my colleagues and my former students. And then somehow when I was starting to panic about how I was going to get more guests, Podmatch found me. And now with Podmatch, I have met so many people all over the world, and I have so many recordings that I'm now working a year ahead.
Wow, that's amazing! It's amazing how you put it out energetically, and then it comes back to you.
Yeah, and I just started a Patreon community too because I just want to expand the conversation about stories. So for anyone who's interested but hasn't yet have the opportunity to study story or analyze one of their favorite novels or films, can you give us just maybe one or two starting points that could get people started, and then they can obviously come to your podcast to learn more? Yeah, I talk to lots of different creative people, not just authors and movie makers, but yes. What I have learned over the years is that every single thing that happens in a story, whether it's a novel, a movie, a television show, it is important. So all of this stuff that's not important, they might have had to write it to help them, but they got rid of it. Especially a movie, you only have 2 hours or something, maybe 3 hours to tell the story, but you have every little thing that an actor does, every facial expression, every bit of body language, every place that the camera, you see through the camera, is showing you something important. And so you have to notice those things. Now, of course, the first time through, you can't see everything because they give you so much information, visual information. A movie does, but it's all, and every single bit of dialogue is also important. So, and I have noticed that a lot of times a character will say something that gives you a clue about what's going to happen later. Like this is a really stupid example, but they'll say, "Oh, I just do not want to go to blah, blah, blah place. I'm never going to go there." And then oh, well, they're going to end up there. They're going to end up in that place. So, and it's a lot of times those are throwaway lines, that you don't really pay attention to. Yeah. And then there's always something that starts they call it the inciting incident. There's always something that starts the problems for the character. So, yeah. And I mean, we have those sort of in life as well. But, when we have our crash and burns, that's starting us off in a new direction. It might not be all these problems. It might be clearing out stuff, for us in real life, it might be an opportunity to clear out stuff. But, yeah.
Yeah. And so, well, that's great. Thank you. For that will give people a little starting point to know that everything that happens in your story, everything you include in your novel, it needs to have a reason to be there. There's a purpose for it. It's not just there for decoration, and your readers will pick up on that. And then that inciting incident, that something unusual or unexpected will happen that then kicks off the plot line.
Right.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
cool. So be looking out for those when you're next reading a novel or watching a movie, and you go into that in more detail in your podcast. Is that right?
Yes, I do talk to filmmakers and we do talk about that kind of thing. I want to talk more about that on my Patreon community. And my sister said today, you should do a version of your dramatic structure class because that's what we do. We talk about see how the camera looked at that person. There's this one movie that I always show, and it's Now Voyager with Betty Davis. And there's a point where the camera shows her feet. It doesn't show her face. It shows her feet and the shoes that she's wearing. And then later in the movie, and she's wearing these industrial strength shoes, you know. And then later in the story, it shows her feet again, and she's wearing these fashionable shoes. So they're showing us the evolution of the character by showing us her shoes. So those are the kinds of details that, you know, I would love to talk to people
Yeah.
about. And so, yeah,
That's
I'm
no, I hadn't noticed that actually. Betty Davis is one of my big heroines. I have a picture of
oh,
her in my
yes.
office, and Now
Mm-hmm.
Voyager, of course, is an absolute classic. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch it now and
Mm-hmm.
look out for those moments. Yeah, beautiful example.
Yeah.
So you're a busy lady. Then you've got your podcast, your blog, and your Patreon community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so who would be a good fit for your community? Is it all creatives, or do you work best? Do you like working best with certain creatives?
Well, I have had some really interesting conversations with visual artists and musicians, uh, but probably mostly it's people who create stories or who are interested in consuming them. So, authors, I already have a couple of author live chats scheduled, even though I don't have very many people following yet, because I just started it a couple of weeks ago. Um, and yeah, so I'm still developing that, but yeah, I want to talk to people with uh, that are writers mostly, and then have the people who are going to read their books ask questions. That's one of the first things I'm doing. But my sister saying that to me about developing a kind of a dramatic structure type of thing with Patreon. I probably will do that at some point as well. Like
Yes.
have a movie night or something where we watch a movie and then we talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so keep our eyes peeled for what's coming next. So
Yeah, right.
yeah, let's come back to your writing and your storytelling. Your debut novel, The Space Between Time, you mentioned it took 7 years to come together, and I think that is kind of normal, absolutely within range. I'd say 5 to 7 years is probably about average for many first-time novelists. What did you find one of the most fun things about writing your book?
This probably people are going to be surprised at this. The creating part was most difficult. Not so much the historical timeline, because that's, I can just go do research about that. But the current timeline was difficult for me to create. Once I got pretty much that created, and I had a couple of writer friends who read the book and made suggestions about, oh, you could cut this part out, or there needs to be a transition between this part and this part. Once I got it pretty much to the place where I was ready to edit, I loved the editing part, because then I could look at the plot outline and go, oh, okay, I could adjust it so that it fit the plot outline. And since I'm really good at analyzing, that part was really fun for me. So
Yeah. Well,
most people say editing, oh, that's horrible. But
well,
I
they
liked it.
do say that that's where the magic happens, is in the editing process, and you've got the material there to work with. So my next question was going to be, what did you find the hardest? But I think maybe you've answered that. That kind of first drafting is pretty hard or
Yes,
challenging.
and my sequel novel, I'm in the drafting process and I'm having trouble with it because it's the current events keep changing, and it's because it's the women are involved in the women's movements in their time periods. And so the current events are changing rapidly in our country. So what do I keep in? What do I make? What do I leave out?
So the book that you're currently working on, this is a sequel to The Space Between Time. Space Between Time. So is it the two same women again, but further along in their lives?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice to be revisiting them.
Yeah. Morgan gets involved in the suffrage movement of the 1800s and 1900s, and Jenna is getting. I was stuck because when I finished the rough draft of The Space Between Time, I started the second book in 2014, and there was nothing for Jenna to do. And then in 2017, when the Harvey Weinstein thing happened, it was like, oh, okay, now I've got something for her to do. Well, now, yesterday, something new happened in our country, and it was like, oh, okay. What am I going to do now? So I've written it in fits and starts these last couple of years since I started the podcast. And so hopefully this summer I'm going to get where I set aside like 45 minutes to work on my novel and first thing in the morning, and then I go work on the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting because and a little bit depressing as well in a way, perhaps, because 100 years ago, whatever, and we're still as women facing not the same issues, but still issues of equality, still issues of our rights and what we are allowed, in inverted commas, to do. So fascinating stuff, and some really topical stuff for you to get into as well.
Yes.
It's going to be juicy.
And I want it to be juicy. I don't want it to be this, skimming over the top. And maybe that's what's kind of scaring me a little bit. It's like, I don't know if I have the chops to write this, but actually I do. It's just I need to get down to it. And it's going to be a lot of editing.
Yeah. Oh, well, listen, Lucinda, it's been lovely chatting with you, learning about your journey through theatre and into novels, and a lot that you're doing with the blog, the podcast, Patreon, writing your novel as well. If listeners want to find out more about the many things that you do, where is the best place for them to do that?
If they go to Sage Woman Chronicles on WordPress, it's sagewoman.life is the URL. There is a tab for my podcast, a tab for my blog, a tab for my books, and I have a techie husband who's probably going to help me with this. I have a tab for the Patreon community too. But right now, if they go to patreon.com/story power, all one word, story and power are capitalized, they'll be able to find that. Yes. So, and the podcast is called Story-Power. And the show notes are on my website, but it's on Google, Spotify, and Apple right now. And I'm hoping this summer to get it up on my YouTube channel.
Wow.
So I have 40 something episodes that I could put up there now. And so
wonderful. Well, I'll be sure to link to those so people can find them. Lucinda, thank you so much for your time, and I hope the new novel goes well.
Thank you, Emma. It's been fun.
If you're a first-time novelist who is struggling to either finish your novel or get those revisions to where you want them to be, then I've got just the thing for you. I have a small group coaching program which runs over 12 months, and over the course of that program I will help you fix those plot problems that you've been struggling with. I'll help you get under the surface of your characters so you really get to know them and what's driving them. And crucially for you, I give you that self-belief that you need to get you through the roller coaster that is writing a novel, so that you can carry on, get to the end, and get your book, your story out into the world so it can change people's lives. If that sounds good to you, if that is something that you'd be interested in doing, I know I can help you get to where you want to be. So book a call with me. Let's have a chat and see if we are a good fit for each other. If you're interested in doing that, then go to emmadesi.com/story builder. I look forward to chatting. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers, hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.